I did today in the morning, I was thinking, so I brought the cards. They are blank inside. And it says just a note. They are lovely, but inside they're blank. I will give them to you now with envelopes, and you're free to, just glue the envelope, no one will know. What I want you to do, I'll give you 15 minutes. Think of anyone in this room or any of the presenters, and I promise that I will mail the letter. I don't know the address right now, but I can easily find out, of anyone who was presenting here, or anyone in this room, your classmates. Write a letter of gratitude for whatever you consider right, okay? You won't need to read it out loud. But I want you to think through this idea of postcards, okay? Okay. And the envelopes are also beautiful. So at least aesthetically. I'll pass the cards first and then I'll bring envelopes. Okay, so anyone? I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I got them. Yeah, sure, and yeah. And I think in the Office Depot, it's in the US.
Oh, okay.
But I think you probably have them here, Office Depot, no? The brand.
Not anymore.
Yeah. Void.
Thank you, Marnie. Unfortunately, that's the last method I'd like to discuss with you. Plebiscite and citizenship statuses. You know the idea of areas of the social life. So plebiscite in the area of institution management, what was one of the most important in the whole Korczakian approach and whole Korczakian system. Before I start to explain you methods, I'd like to tell you that that method, plebiscite, is something about how to let people, how to allow people to express their opinions about other people, and how to know what people think about me. Yes, it's something double-sided process. And why? That is the question. Why? And here is the next very important feature of the Korczak's approach. That he met so many needs, so many children's needs, which were, truly said, invisible for many who took care of children at his time. What do I mean? I'd like to illustrate it by words of Michael Ignatieff. Do you know? Michael, yeah. I was sure, but Michael Ignatieff, I don't know if you know, is now a rector of very prestigious Central European University in Budapest, in Hungary. Excuse me?
It was moved to Vienna.
Now, yes? Or?
Got kicked out of
Yes, yeah. But it's last month or something like this, yeah? Recently, yeah. And he wrote, it's a small book, but it's very, very moving, very good. And he wrote about needs. If you ask me what my needs are, I will tell you that I need the chance to understand and be understood, to laugh and be laughed, to forgive and be forgiven, and the chance to create something which will outlast my life, and the chance to belong to a society whose purposes and commitments I share. especially the last sentence is crucial to understanding of plebiscite. But also the last sentence of that quotation. But if you were to ask me what needs I have as natural, as opposed to a social being, I would quickly find myself restricted to those of my body. And that's the opposition. Natural needs were met by many, many people, yes, to feed, to clothe, to many things. But needs as a social being and as human beings, it's something more important, but also more difficult. Before I start, I'd like to I'd like to encourage you to feel like a kid in the orphan's home. I've chosen these photographs because there are so many people which seem to be lonely. Like that boy, maybe that, I don't know if it's girl or educator, doesn't matter, it's really sad. Because especially if they were new, that's the question, who am I? A son, a daughter? Maybe I have no mother or father, maybe I have an uncle. I am Jew, but where, when, yes? It's so many questions around it, because they were poor Jewish children, poor, so many often abused, so many often very lonely and very uneducated. So who am I? And who am I in that particular institution, which is huge, which is complicated. So many people, so many children, so many adults, so many rules. It's really complicated. And that's why, that's the reason of the need to let them know about other people and let other people write to, or, however. That's the new kids. And they have rights to doubts, questions, feelings, but they really probably, they don't know that they're right, yes? Examples. What do they think about me? I'm ashamed. I'm afraid. How does it work? What should I do? So many questions. Probably do you know that questions, yeah? These questions. But the old children, yes, children who were there before, also they have right to many doubts, questions, and feelings. Who is he, she? Is he dangerous for me? What is her or him story? And I like or I don't like her or him. If so, we have, I think, at least 3 alternatives. From the point of view, someone of responsible, I can hide it, yes, to forget about these needs, these questions, anything. Let it be, without any actions from my side, and to express it, or rather to make circumstances which allow them to express it. I think that only the third alternative is, how to put it, is connected with children's rights and human rights. That's why in orphans' home they invented a plebiscite. Okay, let's imagine that once a year, around October, which is not accidental term, around October, during the meals, in the presence of all children, they voted for children. We don't know exactly this procedure, but I think that it was something like this. I think it was impossible to vote for all children because there were too many. So let's imagine that we have 3 boxes with 3 names, Jacob, Esther, Hannah, for example. And all children had 3 cards, 3 pieces of papers with 0, plus, and minus. It means, of course, 0, he or she is indifferent to me. Plus, I like him or her. Minus, I don't like. And they, they just vote to, they put a proper card into box. And that's all. At the end of the day, the results of plebiscite was announced. So each of kids knew how many pluses, minuses, and zeros they had. And depends on it, they had also, it wasn't, the result wasn't only one criteria, but one of the most important. They were given also citizenship statuses. What kind of? They had 5, Troy said 6, at least 5, categories. A troublesome newcomer, someone who is in orphan's home more than 1 year, but he's still, unsure. I really, it's something like distance between me and him or her. An indifferent inhabitant, someone who is, rather indifferent. Maybe inhabitant, someone, he's okay, but nothing something special. A companion, it's really good. A nice companion, it's pretty surely good. And once a year, probably also around October, there was also a king of children. So a kid who had, the most pluses. So that was the hierarchy. As you know, October wasn't accidental term. Why? Because some of you knows it better than me. Because of Yom Kippur. Because just around, in autumn, just around October, sometimes November, because it's changing, it's Yom Kippur. That's the definition from the Britannica. And I've bolded important from our point of view. So, that's the holiday when Jews seek to expiate their sins and achieve a reconciliation with God. But the purpose of this Yom Kippur is to effect individual and collective purification by the practice of forgiveness of the sins of others and by sincere repentance for one's own sins against God. So, can you see similarity between two, between this holiday and plebiscite? Plebiscite was, how to put it, like a non-religious form of forgiveness, of individual and collective, maybe not purification, but it was something like, let them see what I have in my mind, something like this. So it was very conscious, and they made just a relation between religion and social culture, social norms. But we had also another types of plebiscites. That was probably the most thrilling plebiscite. when they had a new kid, after 1 month, there was a plebiscite around the new kid. And if the number of pluses was less than a number of minuses, he or she was endangered by being expelled. Because that was a voice of the group, a voice of the society. That was a warning for a new kid to improve her or his behavior. And it was really serious. They had also farewell plebiscite. Ira told about farewell plebiscite yesterday probably. Farewell plebiscite not only for children, but also for educators. Educators had only farewell plebiscite, not during their work in the orphans' home. What was really important, that confirmation of that status was possible only once a year. But degradation was possible during the year, especially for, as you can see, for bad behavior towards younger. Someone could be automatically degraded. Now I'd like to tell you something about consequences of the results of plebiscite. First of all, if you wanted to be a member of parliament of the orphans' home, it was also once a year. You must to be, how to put it, an object of the plebiscite. It was obligatory for all candidates to parliament of the orphans' home. Second thing, Court of Peace, as you know. The judge could be also only a kid after 1 year in the orphans' home. After he couldn't be a beginner, a beginner. And the third thing is to be a member of the Room of Silence. It sounds probably like from Harry Potter or something, I don't know. But what was the need? Orphans' home was so crowded and so noisy. And for Korczak was obvious that children should have a place, where they could have a rest, where they could do their homework, but not for 100 children. So for being a member of the Room of Silence, the kid had to have a good status in plebiscites. We don't know exactly which one, but probably an indifferent companion or above, not less. And but there was one day during the whole year in which all children from the orphans' home visited the Room of Silence. Why? Because there were 3 portraits. Do you recognize him? That's the, excuse me, that's the, yes, Józef Piłsudski, a chief of state between 2 wars. He passed away in 1935. Extremely important man, politician, whatever. Yeah. The second was, would you like to guess? A truck of politicians. Do you recognize him? That's the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. But he wasn't here because he was a president, but he was, I have to read it, Director of the U.S. Food Administration and next American Relief Administration, which was the agenda or agency which was responsible for the help for the Central and East Europe after the First World War. And for Korczak, it was really, it's moving and funny at the same time, because there were descriptions of them, and we know the texts. And about Herbert Hoover was, he is here not because he sent us food or clothes or many things, but because he sent us also a football, which was really unknown at the time. So that was the explanation. And could you imagine that the third portrait, we don't know, is the portrait of Esther Weintraub. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't a chief of anything. She was one of pupil from the orphans' home. She was graduated, I don't remember exactly, but probably at the beginning of the First World War. She moved to Switzerland because she had job there. But when she realized the situation in the orphans' home is really bad, and that, you know, diseases and it's very dangerous, she came back and she took care of children. And she was infected by typhus, and she passed away. And she passed away in February, I don't remember the day, 1918, and the day when, you know, all children from orphans' home visited the room of silence was the day of anniversary of her death. So that's the story. And could you imagine how powerful is that example for children in the orphans' home? To, you know, to make the role with Piłsudski, Hoover, and Esther Weintraub. That was, I think, extremely powerful experience. Another example, and it's also connected with Canada. That boy under the dot, his original name was Beryl, probably, never mind, Beryl. Later, he was known as Leon, just Leon. Yeah? Yes, that's the Beryl Glusman. And he was one of pupils from orphans' home. He moved to Canada in 1930. He was, I think, maybe 16. He was 16 or something like this. He was a young boy, really young boy. And he was one of the 1,600 something Jewish people who were moved to Canada that year. You can read about him in the book by Olga Medvedevna too, May Their Lot Be Lighter. It's accessible in the internet on website, you know that website, Janusz Korczak Association of Canada, of course. So you can find that book there. And with postcards too. And Leon Glusman was given by postcard, you know. That's the description of this procedure of the farewell plebiscite. So he collected 100 pluses and only 4 minuses and 16 zero. And that's the postcard, Forget-Me-Nots farewell postcard. That's the, you know, number of votes. And that is the photo from the site of one of the most important tax planning and accounting firm in Ottawa. It's GGFL, Ginsberg, Glusman, Fage and Leeds. Ginsberg and Glusman established their own firm in 1946, and now GGFL is one of the, is from the top 10 firms in Ottawa. Do you recognize Leon Glusman? He? Yes, it's him. That's the Leon Glusman. Here and here. He passed away in 2012, 7 years ago. And the last thing, words of Maria Falska, who was the director of our home. It was an orphanage for Polish children, and Korczak was also a co-director of that orphanage between 1919 and 1935. That's her words about plebiscite. I think for me the most important is qualifications of citizenship teach us to the ability to climb any difficulty step by step towards the top. That's the quotation also from Olga Smedjeeva Natu book. I think plebiscite and court of peers are probably the most controversial methods of Korczak, but I think that in this whole system it played a really important role, and for children, not for all I'm sure, but for children it was also a powerful tool for improving their lives. And that's also my farewell postcards, because it's my last activity here. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you one day in the future. And thank you, and if you have any question, please. Thank you.
Questions? Jane?
So
Jane, yeah?
if a child got more minuses than pluses, then what? How were they helped? You know? Or, I mean, I'm assuming he didn't just...
Yes, we can only imagine, because we don't know exactly. That was the procedure only at the beginning. Yes, not later, not after the year, but only at the beginning. And probably there were some possibilities. One of them was someone like honorable mentor. So child like this could have someone who was someone like mentor. He or she helped him to improve his or her behavior and to gain more pluses than minuses. So that's the first thing I have in my mind. The second is maybe something like conversations, warnings, maybe bets also, maybe to show many additional methods and encourage him or her to use it. For example, I don't know, some duties. I mean, work for the orphans and in the orphans' home in many areas. We don't know also how many children, but I think not so many, were expelled because of this plebiscite. Yeah.
And do we know, in a year or so, would there be another plebiscite and you could see that you did better, or?
Yeah, you mean after a year, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Judy?
Yeah, my question was about how religious was the education in the orphanage?
That's the big question, because in fact it wasn't religious, and that was an issue for many parents, of course, because Korczak, two areas: one religion and two cultural identity. So many parents, were angry because Korczak too much acculturated or something, assimilated their children. But it doesn't mean that the religion wasn't present in the orphanage home, because it was. For Korczak, it was very important, extremely important, to give children an opportunity to pray. For him, it was obvious that it's one of the needs. Yes, it's a spiritual need, and it's funny. No, it's not funny, but depends on the point of view. Because in the Polish home was in Pruszków near the Warsaw between 1919 and 28, and they had a new building. Yes, in 1928, and before that, Maria Falska and many other people consulted with Korczak, amongst other, also about a chapel, yes, for children. And she, as a director, refused because she was an atheist. So much that because she was in Ukraine during the revolution in Russia, and her husband and her daughter, probably her son,
Her daughter.
daughter, yes, were they passed away, and because of funeral was religious, she refused to to participate in.
She was an atheist, and she refused to go to the religious funeral
Exactly.
of her husband.
Yeah. So, and the legend or gossip was, in the Polish our home there is no chapel because what? Because Korczak is Jewish. Yes, that was the gossip in Poland. So they, children in the orphans' home, they had opportunities to pray. Even they had an opportunity to have a special postcard for regular praying. So but from the point, the organizational or institutional point of view, it wasn't a religious orphanage.
If I could though, they did celebrate Jewish holidays.
Yeah, sure.
Because my
Of
mother
course.
told me that
They
never
did.
they never celebrate.
Oh.
My grandparents' family didn't celebrate Jewish holidays at home. They went to the orphanage and celebrated with the children there.
Yeah, that was very, very important part of their life. I mean,
I was just wondering, when the new kid came, did they go through with him about all the rules and what was going to happen, or would they just let him?
like workshop or like training,
Yeah,
yes, or something like this.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's imagine that you have all of the issues I've told you, that you can sit and listen about it in one day. It's impossible. No, it was like learning by doing. So it was a beauty of this honorable mentor to not to teach him or her, but just to show many situations, many possibilities, many opportunities. That's the situation in which you can, for example, use a court of peers. And that's the situation when you can use bets. And that was the way. That's why being a beginner lasted a year, yes, because the whole system was really complicated. But after a year, all of them were experts of the orphan's home, indeed, because it's not accidental, because Korczak, in a beautiful book, do you know When I Am Little Again? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I love the book. He wrote there, we, he meant children, we are experts of our lives. Yeah? So,
If I may, do you remember that quote we were talking from Korczak, children are foreigners? Mm-hmm. So he treats them as foreigners, those who are newcomers to the asylum, to the orphanage. And for a year, they are foreigners, they need to adapt to a new life, new land, if you wish, new language, new customs. And after a year, you are not a foreigner anymore, you are part of us.
Can I just a little piece of information about Leon Guzman.
yeah.
In 2006, 7 or 8, I think, he provided the money in Ottawa for the Ottawa Children's Theatre to write a play about Korczak. And Hannah Moscovich wrote a play that's called The Children's Republic, which was originally written for the Ottawa Children's Theatre, so it had lots of parts for children. And it was an okay play. She then rewrote it, and it was 2 or 3 years ago, it was produced in Victoria for the first time. When she did it the second time, she wrote it through the eyes of the children. And it's a much better play. So that if you ever, it hasn't, I don't think it's been published yet, but it will be one of these days, and definitely worth looking at. It's really
That's
beautiful.
fascinating. Is it somewhere on YouTube or no?
No. I mean, she's a very well-known Canadian playwright, so you could always write to
I've
her.
heard her name, yeah.
It's
Wonderful,
same title?
thank you.
Same title?
The Children's Republic, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And he funded it.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, as I said, yesterday it was a little heartbreaking, and I decided I spent half a night on putting together this presentation because I believe it's very important. I didn't plan to, but I think we should know about it. The word authorial sounds quite strange in English because it's a direct translation from Russian, and it comes from the word author. So we're talking about the author of the concept or of the school or the educational institution, and because of it, the adjective is with this suffix, and it becomes authorial schools. So the concept was born in Russia 30, 40 years ago, and then I was one of the researchers who worked on it. In fact, it was the theme of my postdoc thesis, and I found the place for Korczak in authorial institutions, of course. So I thought it would be important for you to know a little about it. So I tried to find similar terms. In Russian pedagogy, that is innovative schools, experimental schools, authorial schools, as I said, in Russia they use the term. In the US and Canadian as well, that is effective schools, alternative schools, schools of quality, key schools, magnet schools. Now there are several charter schools which go under this rubric, and we can go on. So if you take the features of authorial schools and effective schools, there are some commonalities, and among them, these are those: high expectations of students and teachers, which is a little different from public schools, right? You usually expect that students do well and teachers kind of behind the scenes. Principal as a school leader, not as an authoritative figure, but as a leader in different things. Favorable environment within the school. Teachers' cooperation, that is mostly famous now in Finland, where teachers do what they do and produce the high results because of the cooperation of teachers within school building. Teachers' support of the school mission and goals. I'm not asking to raise your hands, but those of you who work in schools, who can recite your school mission? Just think about it. Oh, you can. Perfect. So active parents and community participation in the school life, because schools never exist in the vacuum, You need the support of the parents of the kids, and you need the support of the community. So what are the key indicators which make a school an authorial school? You need first the creator. So if we think about Korczak's orphan's home, take Korczak out of the picture, what's left? And if there's no person who is following in his shoes, in his steps, nothing will happen. So the figure, and it's not necessarily a charismatic figure. It could be a person who is as humble and not really looking as a school principal, because there were situations when new people would come to meet with Korczak and they would see him in his green kind of gown, like he was wearing a gown like medical personnel, but not white but green. And people thought he was a janitor. And they were looking around for someone famous Korczak, and somebody from the kids would say, oh, that's Korczak. That's Korczak. Really? We thought it's a cleaning person. So it's not necessarily a figure who is immediately standing out, who is, there are such, and there's nothing bad about it, but it's not the most important thing. There's also a necessary indicator that is the concept, which starts with the school mission and school values, and that's extremely important. It's developed. And a specific culture within a school. I know one great school principal who worked as a school principal for over 60 years. He tended to say, when you come into a good school, you can smell it. You can smell it. And it's not perfume. It's not the smell of children's, something not really pleasant. No, it's the smell of the school culture which unites. And the smell comes from smiles, from friendliness, from openness. I was about to visit U Hill Secondary School, which is here on campus, and I'm talking with the principal, and I'm saying, Tim, is there any password, or I need a permit to park on the premises and then get into the building? You know what he said? He said, Tatiana, this is Canada. He made a pause and said, no permits, come on in. And I came, and the school culture, it's openness. I remember my first experience working at a school building with, I told you, the authoritarian school principal who was beyond words authoritarian. So you walk in the corridor and you would never see any child just quietly, comfortably walking if the school principal is somewhere inside. Like, I see her, okay. The first door, immediately in. Yes?
Just to say that it's probably similar for a company.
Absolutely. Because it's based on organizational culture concept. Of course, for any institution, children's hospitals say, right? You come in, you are either frightened to death because you're sick, you need help, or you immediately feel like there are toys everywhere, there are pictures on the walls, people approach you with friendly faces, or they look down, they don't talk with you. And this all, believe me or not, it comes usually if there's one personality who is in charge. And he makes clear how, where, what, not in terms of absolute guidelines, but behaving like this. When I was listening, for me not to forget this, when I was listening to Wojtek, I remembered, I recommend strongly, there's a wonderful TED Talk. It's entitled, Every Kid Needs a Champion. And it's done by Rita Pearson. She's a famous educator. And I think 2013, every kid needs a champion. So every school, if you wish, needs a champion. Every educational establishment. So out of all these indicators, I put together this definition. So an authorial school is an establishment, usually educational, which has its own unique culture and which is created by a founder. and or his follows or her follows. And it's not necessarily that this person works as a school principal. This person could be behind the scenes, but if this person trains a team who pick up and use the concept, then it's still an authorial school. The latter, the concept, is accepted and followed by the teachers, school students, and parents. And if any of these elements, teachers or students or parents, do not support the concept and the school culture and the ideas and values, hardly the school will become really authorial. Because if parents tell the kid at home, you know what, whatever they say at school, it's okay, do as they say, but it's not right. At home, we will tell you what and how. Then it's very different. So the difference is authorial schools existed all the history of mankind. If you think of Plato, if you think of Comenius, if you think of Pestalozzi, who I mentioned, who knew the name of Pestalozzi? Like between us, confidentially. Okay, yeah, of course. I mean, in Europe, every college of education, every faculty of education, every teacher's program has Pestalozzi as part of the curriculum, because Pestalozzi was an extremely important figure in the Swiss educational horizon. He created a number of schools and orphanages. He was no less of a humanitarian as Korczak. I want to give you, I will leave him with you. There's lots of written about him you can read or listen to different videos about him. What I want to give you, which is not very commonly published, he was not a handsome man, to say the least. And he had a very low self-esteem. So once he fell in love with a beautiful woman, not only beautiful, but also from a wealthy family. So he felt like zero chances. But he wanted to tell her about his love. So he wrote her a love letter, and it was I read it. I don't know whether it's translated into English. It was in Russian in the book of love letters. Pretty incredible. And the way he was, he wrote in this letter, he gave her every reason not to fall in love with him. So he's writing to her, telling her about his love, saying, I understand completely. I am this, that, and that, which definitely leaves me no chance. And she married him, as it happens, because he was absolutely brilliant. And another situation, which is also not known, is his institution became very famous in Switzerland, and once Alexander II, the Emperor of Russia, was visiting, and he pretended to be a big humanitarian, the emperor, and he wanted to give money, to donate, so he was talking with this educator, who was kind of weird, but, you know, kings have to deal with weird people as well. So, but when you stand, I wouldn't give names, we know other people who would tap on the shoulder of the Queen of England, right? But he was standing at a distance. Of course, you don't come very close to the king. And Pestalozzi started talking about the necessity of giving education to Russian kids, to do it, to put more, because Russia was not educated. And he was approaching the king in his agitation closer and closer and closer. And the king had to go backwards and backwards and backwards. And he finally hit the wall behind himself. So Pestalozzi literally kept him in that corner, talking with him, passionately telling him about the necessity of education for children. I mean, And then he finally grabbed his uniform like in agitation and saying, you need to do it. So imagine the scene, yeah? The Emperor of Russia and some pistolozzi. But that's how he was. So he was a very humble person, but when it came to children and education, he was like Korczak. And because of it, it's very unpleasant, let's put it like this, that he's never mentioned as the one who actually was the first who wrote that hand, head, and heart should be educated together. And that's what he was practicing. So there are different types of authorial schools. When there's no continuation, when it's not created as something which can be reproduced, which is totally dependent on the personality, that's what Korczak's institution was at the beginning. Personality in the same building. Then it dies with the death, physical or not physical, but the person leaves, of its creator. And for example, Leo Tolstoy, I told you, who was not only one of the greatest world writers, he was also an educator. He founded, on his estate, he founded this Yasna Polyanskaya school, and he was teaching there humbly, because he always considered that village children could be much brighter than an educator like him. Vasily Sukhomlinsky, I mentioned him several times. That's the one who wrote the book, The Heart I Give to the Children. And that's another one who was talking about the necessity of hand, heart, and head educated together. He did a number of incredible things. I will name just a few for you to have an impulse to read, because his books are translated into English. So he was the first, at the time he started elementary school in the village, it was 1947. He came very badly wounded after the Second World War, and he was a teacher and then school principal from 1947 to 1970 when he died. So, and he died very early, as you see, 52 years. So when he started that village school, it's in a village in Ukraine. Ukraine was under Nazis. Everything was burned. Almost no fathers of those kids. Almost no mothers of those kids. Grandparents. Kids didn't have anything. And he was the first who said, we should start elementary education not from 7, but from 6 years old. At the time, it was 7 in Russia. And what he suggested, looking at the kids, knowing the countryside and knowing the village life, he suggested to have this first year, he called it a school under the blue skies. From 6 to 7, this 1 year, kids were allowed to come bare feet. Living in Seattle, you know, I'm learning it's okay to walk without socks, without shoes downtown, but at the time it was much more proper. And but what he allowed, no school uniform, no shoes. The school under the blue sky was literally the school under the blue sky. All the classes were outside in nature when the weather allowed. And it's absolutely phenomenal how differently kids behave when they are in nature. They walk into the forest, they find a lawn, they sit down, they are among the, nature, trees, flowers, birds are singing. There's another incredible innovation which is so badly forgotten, both in Russia and never known anywhere in the US or Canada, anywhere in the world, that is his room of fairy tales. If you recall yourselves, I'm sure you do, when you were children, children love fairy tales. Children love when a mother, grandmother, whoever, an adult, sits next to them, read or tell a fairy tale. But at the same time, would you agree, Alice? You work with little ones, yeah? So they also are very creative, and they can create a fairy tale, right? So picking from this, what he suggested was he put it on the timetable. So once a week, every elementary school child would have a class called fairy tales. A class, mandatory. But the class is in the room, which has no furniture, just a rug on the floor, and the figurines from famous Russian fairy tales everywhere. The children sit on the rug in the middle or anywhere they want, and when the newcomers, when they start school, they listen to the teacher who tells them fairy tales, but at some point, some kid would always say, let me tell you a fairy tale. I know a story. They don't say a fairy tale. They say a story. I know a story. And then kids start telling stories. And these stories are usually much richer in context and beauty than the teacher's ones. And that's what the teacher wants. So she lets them tell their stories. She does, she says, okay, let's look through the window. Do you see that bird, the squirrel there? Let's name the bird. What's the name of the bird? Tell the adult, let's name the squirrel. It's kind of, yeah, seriously. The kids immediately would come up with different names, and the teacher would say, okay, let's write a story about a squirrel. The kids first don't know how to write, so they create stories orally, easily. You know, give kids an impulse and they would give you a long story, many episodes. What happened to the squirrel today, tomorrow, and how she will live ever after. So they invent these stories. Then they learn how to write. And then the teacher says, okay, now we will write our stories. So during 4 years of elementary school in Russia today and before, all the grades are together, from first to the very end, all through high school, all grades together, like Sigrid was talking about his school. So all grades together. So they were writing these stories. And then in the 3rd or 4th grade, the teacher would say, okay, let's make a book of your stories. So each child would glue together these stories, and they will also put illustrations. So when they graduate the elementary school, they have this book of their own stories, each of them. Now, I think the best innovation comes next. So they give all these books to their teacher, and she keeps them for the next 6 or 7 years. And at the graduation party, because it's the same school. Now, if you recall your own elementary school teachers, we first come short. And the teacher, whatever short she is always taller, right? Then we grow, and the teacher becomes kind of shorter, and then even more, and then the shortest. And then the high school students who are 17, especially boys, they're all like a few heads above. What happens at the graduation party, and of course, the period of life, the teens period, it's so rich in different events, they forget about this whole thing. And all of a sudden, here's an elementary school teacher getting on the stage, bringing something onto the stage, it gives me goosebumps even to talk about it, because imagine how emotional it is for kids. And she celebrates their graduation. She says good words about them. And then she says, I have a special present for each of you. And each of these graduates, adults now, they receive each his or her own book of fairy tales. It's like a gift from your childhood. It's like going back to go forward. You know what I mean? Like, this is such an incredible touch of, let me show you, even if you failed in your middle or high school, yeah, and if you didn't do well, but you were so creative. Look at what you managed to do when you were a child. And for many of them, it was, a revelation. It was changing their lives. And this is what everything and many other things came with this person. So why is he not known? I guess it's a rhetoric question. Don't you think he should be part of the curriculum together with Korczak? I'm talking about teachers training curriculum or professional development, because this is the richness of educational thought which is forgotten. And because of that and many others, we're talking about things which should be known. So the next is an authorial school becomes a model, which means it's not one, it's not two, it's not three. It's a cluster of schools which work on the founder's concept. And the founder is not necessarily there. He could be gone physically, but the way the concept was constructed, it can be used in somebody else's hands. You know what I mean? It can be used and reused. So to me, Korczak is within this concept here. His school, his institution, it's not school per se, but educational institution, that is a model which has been replicated in different variants, and we will be talking today about summer camps which work on his concept. So this person, if you don't know, I strongly recommend Larry Kolbeck. He was a very famous moral psychologist who, by the way, committed a suicide. I'm kind of seeing a trend. You heard Bruno Bettelheim yesterday, yeah, committed a suicide. Kolbeck also committed a suicide. So, but his theory about moral stages of moral development is very, very famous. And he is part of the curriculum in psychology. I'm sure you know the name, yeah, those of you who started psychology. So he created what is called just community. It is a school within a school. It's usually 100 students, and within a big public school, usually high school, there's this just community where everything is done on a democratic decision-making ground. And I was in different just communities visiting, observing, and when I first came to this kind of general meeting, and they were all sitting on the floor, 100 kids, I was looking around. I was the only one sitting on the chair, you know. So I was looking, trying to find one teacher. And apparently there were a few of them. I couldn't really recognize who's teacher, who's a student. It was so blended, you know. It was a real just community. And there were many other things which they are doing. So I can't go into in details about this, but I would recommend to read about just communities. So from a single school like Sukhamlinsky's school or Tolstoy's school to become a model, there are some required conditions. If any of these conditions is not met, it won't work. For example, training of teachers. You cannot come and say, tomorrow we're becoming just community. Hello? And teachers would think to themselves, seriously, for our salary, we're doing what we're doing. Forget it. So you need to train teachers. cultural translation of the concept is extremely important. If you bring something from the United States, you bring it to a progressive school principal in Russia, for example. You need to translate a number of terms, not in terms of translating from English into Russian, but translating from the language of American educational theory into Russian educational theory and practice. Is that clear? We need this cultural translation, otherwise it won't work. The same about Korczak's ideas, by the way, to be translated not only in terms of the language, but in terms of the concepts and the language which is known and clear here. Because of that, many translations fail because it's absolutely out of the cultural context. Okay? So Rudolf Steiner, the name is, yes?
Just,
yeah.
it needs funding, it needs money.
Of course, but when it's funded, there are many other things. You know, there are people who come with money and say, let's do it, but it doesn't work because, yeah, absolutely.
Money.
Yeah, but money, yeah, sure. So when I say to somebody, Rudolf Steiner, who is that? When I say Waldorf schools, everyone knows, right? So that is a marriage because Rudolf Steiner is the founder of Waldorf schools. So that is when schools become a movement. And here are the conditions which show when schools from an authorial single phenomenon and a model become a movement. And they can be replicated in different cultural contexts. Another one, which I'm sure each of you knows, is Montessori schools. Practically same thing. You would think Montessori, who is an Italian, lived and worked, if you know, for 12 years in India, the rest of her life, at the end of her life, because she had to flee from Nazism. And Indian culture and Italian culture, European culture, you can imagine the difference. But it worked. In India, there's a huge number of Montessori schools. In the Netherlands, a few years ago, still probably saying now, 40% of all elementary schools work as Montessori schools. Again, Dutch culture is very different from Italian culture. So there are these conditions which allow to replicate, but when they are not met, it doesn't work. This person I'm sure known, John Dewey. Look at the days of life. I always say, you know, living in education probably helps to become a really, really long-time survivor, yeah? Over 90 years, and at that period of time, when people hardly lived to 80. So Dewey's idea of progressive schools and what he brought to America was literally changing the horizon, changing the perception of schools, changing what schools should and should not do. And it was like a revolution in education. So a paradigm was changed, and authorial schools became a change of a paradigm. Okay? Now, common features of all the four types I mentioned: a school as a single phenomenon, a model, a movement, and a paradigm. Always needed a concept, always needed strong values which are created, known, supported. Always needed a school culture based on humanistic relationships. And Korczak is talking about relationships everywhere. Every remarkable teacher knows if you don't build relationships first, nothing will work. You can come in with a great curriculum, with a great lesson plan, but if they are not yours, meaning you are not theirs, you know what I mean? nothing will work. Creativity. I told you several times, I'm never tired to repeat. Children are born with this ability to be creative. They're able to play, invent, do whatever. Imagine the squirrel with the whole, name and story. But we kill it. We kill it in kindergartens and then in schools. And if we keep killing, it's gone, it's dead. And then there are lots of boring adults, unfortunately. The results should be stable and they should be effective. Otherwise, the school will not go on. Because if parents and the community doesn't see the results, it won't work. And you start with a few people, supporters, but it's like circles on the water. It goes wider and wider, and it brings in all the people who live in the community, parents, former students, and former students become parents of your new students, and they come to school, And ideally, it's a neighborhood with the school, which is the center of it. Are you still following it, or it's too much for you to take in? Okay? So most favorable conditions, here, Judith, we will come to finance. So there are social, pedagogical, personal, and financial. So if to talk about social, you cannot, start in a thorough humanistic school, which I didn't mention. There could be authoritarian schools where there's an incredibly authoritarian figure of a school principal, and then the whole school culture and everything is under the dominance of this figure. I'm talking only about humanistic schools. I didn't research authoritarian, although it could be an interesting topic as well. So there should be a social political order structure which allows this type of school. You can't imagine something like this in the Nazi Germany as a public school, right? So you need a social order. And you need what I call social soil. And also the best way is cultural traditions which exist already in this particular culture, which allow it. Because if you bring something great, but it's so different, it's so alien, it won't work. You probably know that Russia is famous for potatoes, but you probably don't know that Peter the Great brought potatoes first to Russia, and no one wanted to use them because they were so different. They were absolutely not part of what agricultural community would use. And then it took years and years to actually adopt it, accept it, make it yours. So until you really make it yours, when you can say, my school, and think of the language as well. When you say, my school, or you go to my school, or you go to the school, you go to work, or you go to my school, you say, you hear the difference? This immediately shows whether you adopted it. It's just a place of work, or you go there because it's yours. Another test is when children go to school and the body language, and the children leave the school building. So the children go to school, they're smiling, they're happy, they're open, they come into the building a little earlier, they sit down, they use time to prepare. That's my school. And the last bell rings. In bad schools, the bell is still ringing, the entrance door is already open from inside, running out. If they're running out of the school building, something is wrong there. Something is definitely wrong. They don't want to be in the building. So another set of conditions is pedagogical. So, as I said, teachers, staff should be able to accept this new and non-traditional type of work. And potentially, they should be ready. They shouldn't be very rigid in their minds. Then they should be definitely a charismatic leader or a person who is not charismatic, as I said, but who is ready to lead, who has a vision, and of course funding. At the same time, Sukhomlinsky, about funding, was working in a village school which doesn't have a roof because 1947, villages destroyed absolutely fully by fascists. So what he did, he showed the parents and whoever families remained that the school was so worth it that the community rebuilt the school, the village. Here's one example how the village remembers Sukhomlinsky to this day. So I visited this school with my students, teachers-to-be, in 1989. He died in 1970. How many of you would go to the gravestone of your former teacher, even if, or school principal, even if he was great, 19 years after he died? And you are an adult, you moved on. So we went to the museum, which is within the school building, and it's in his apartment. He lived in the building. And then we went to the village cemetery. And believe me or not, on a regular day, no holiday, no nothing, no remembrance day, there were fresh flowers on the gravestone. Lillian, come on in, please. There were fresh flowers on the gravestone. Does it tell you anything? So no words needed. There was, of course, a huge portrait of him on the wall of the school building. How many portraits we have? We pass by, they are part of the furniture. We don't just stop you and ask, what kind of a portrait? You just pass by? You would not always remember, right? Because portraits, when they are not meaningful, they remain just piece of the wall. But the gravestone, no one knows. You go to the cemetery, you put flowers on the gravestone. Who would say, oh, good man, or good woman, or great? No one, right? You do it out of your heart because you remember this teacher. That's a merit the teacher had. So what prevents or allows authorial schools to develop? They could die, as it happened with the Sukhomlinsky school. The authorities did everything for the school to become mediocre. They put an authoritarian school principal. They did everything to literally put the school down the hill and just pushed it down the hill. And it happened. I mean, it's still there. It's a nice building, but nothing like what it was. So dependence on the personality. If the dependence is very strict on the personality of the founder, then the founder is gone, the school is gone. And very quickly. Can you relate to this? The next one is value core. So if values are created and they're so strong and they're accepted by teachers and parents and students, then they stay. But if they're fully attached to the personality of the leader, then the leader is gone and the values are gone. And the next one is this component of methods, strategies, interventions, which are so developed that they will be in use after the person is gone. So any of these three not there, the school will not become something in the future. So the school culture is a function of four components. It's on purpose. I put this one, number one, horizontally and others kind of equally, because the culture of the school principal, and when I say culture, I don't mean he's an educated person. I don't mean he knows culture that well. I mean his educational culture, his relationships culture, the way he behaves, the way he treats people, the way he teaches. So the culture of the school principal, the system of values, cooperation and partnership, and orientation of school, creative orientation of school activities. I'm usually using this medical term. I'm saying a good school culture is contagious. You get sick with this beautiful culture. You accept it immediately. Would you agree with that? That's about the smell of the school. You come in, you smell it. It's wonderful, and you're right there. And I usually give my students the example, you eat a candy and you have paper left, right, in your hand. And you walk in an extremely clean street. You would keep it in your hand. You will not drop it accidentally, kind of. I don't say, I just, yeah. But you will keep it because it's kind of, it's contagious. Everywhere is clean, and all of a sudden you drop it. But you walk in a dirty street, then one piece more, one piece less. It's contagious again. So positivity, as much as negativity, could be contagious. And that's what Korczak did as well. The atmosphere of the school was so contagiously good that it spread out of the walls of the building. It covered a lot of Warsaw Ghetto, although the conditions, the situation was so incredibly harsh. You know what I mean? So that's about how a school could become humanistic or not humanistic, and the functions. And I want especially concentrate on number 4. Such schools always existed in the world, in the history, and what they did, and they still do, they show other educators and the community and politicians and everyone this hope in the world of education. Here's one school. It could be small. It could be somewhere, nowhere, but it exists, and there's hope. And I want to finish this with a very different concept, but I think it relates. There's a movie, a documentary, which is based on research. And the research is made on the concept of happiness. So there's a group of researchers who actually studied who is most happy in the world. And they have indicators, and they traveled all over the world. And what they realized, happiness absolutely does not depend on the amount of wealth, on the society where you live, excuse me, whether it's developed or not developed. It depends on absolutely different factors. In fact, most happy are people living under very humble circumstances, not having a lot. They're smiling, they're positive, they're happy. So if it's possible to say that children in Korczak's home were happy, I think at least he made everything possible and impossible to make them feel happy. Was he happy? No. He was a sad man, understanding, as an old Jew, as they say, understanding what's coming. He was sad. And I will read to you, not now, there's an incredible small book which he wrote. It's published. It's called The Praise of Those Who Don't Pray. And there are prayers like a prayer of a mother, a prayer of a little girl, a prayer of a student, and there's also a prayer of a teacher. So I would read it to you. I strongly recommend to read the whole thing. but I want to leave you with this. I apologize for bringing this concept, which was out of our plan originally, but I thought it's important to know the world is much bigger, the world of education, than people consider today or yesterday. There are many centuries behind us. Questions? If there are no questions, let's have a short break. 7.5 minutes. Jane, yeah.
Well, I don't have a question,
Yeah,
but I have a comment.
absolutely, and comments as well, of course.
About, when you talked about how children have this innate sense of play and
Yeah.
creativity that in some places that just gets killed in them. I would say that you end up with often, not always, but often with adults who have very little self-esteem and very little sense of their own power. And the more we are here, the more I feel what Korczak instilled in the children was a sense of their own power.
Yeah, and dignity.
Yeah, but what I also wanted to say is that it doesn't take an enormous amount to rekindle that creativity in adults. I
would agree with that. I would agree with
I
that.
know that there's a danger in taking the one experience and expanding on it, but I've experienced that any number of times in my own work with adults.
Mhm.
And they're usually, when that happens, they can remember when it was extinguished,
Mhm.
and they're furious.
That, why it was killed.
Yeah, but they may not know why, but they remember the moment when they shut down.
Mhm.
And then they're able to open it again, and so I don't know that that they intrinsically then go on to become boring, but if there's somebody around who can open the door again, then it's all just sitting there. It's like the child is inside one of the
Yeah,
adults,
absolutely.
like right
Yeah,
at the
yeah.
door waiting. for
Yeah,
it to happen.
so there's hope. There's
Yeah.
hope for adults as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other comments, Alice, do you want to?
Yes, just want to share a personal experience because I was working with children since like 5 years ago, and I used to live in Victoria, BC. They do have a forest school there, and then for children aged 3 to 6, and then what they do is like the whole day they spend outside in the forest, and then there's like 2 teachers leading the whole group, and they just pack their own lunch, and then they just sit on the like.
So you were observing or you worked there?
I was like doing my practicum there, so not.
So how different is this school? What
So
would you say?
I think children are really enjoying that, but it's not quite mainstream in Canadian like education system because you can see there are only like 10 children. They never really have a full class because there are like not many parents are willing to send their children to there, especially in the winter time. They feel like, oh, the children may get sick, won't have. But actually, children are really enjoying it.
Okay. Claire, you want to say something?
I think that cultural translation piece kind of spoke to me in terms of how we are trying to implement a social pediatrics program, Circle the Child, here in Vancouver, in a completely different, with a different population and different considerations to make. So I think as Alicia and I are doing the course, we're kind of processing that, and so that spoke to me in your presentation. Just we've really been thinking about that and what that looks like in terms of cultural translation.
Because there are cultures which are community oriented. In these cultures, making a circle like this, and here's a circle. There are cultures which are individually oriented, individualistical, I should say, oriented, and Western cultures are mostly like this. And then making a circle, formally and informally, is much more difficult, right?
And yes. And the population we deal with in terms of creating a circle, we have different sort of
Huge
challenges to overcome, or I don't want to say it in a negative way, because it's
Yeah.
not necessarily that, but, you know, making those considerations and figuring out, you know, how we can go about this work in a way that works and is safe for the population that we work with.
Because they will fall out of the circle if they don't feel safe there.
Absolutely, they will not even come to the circle
Yeah.
if they don't feel
Yeah.
safe.
Yeah.
So how are we going to do that?
Yeah,
Big
that's
question.
powerful, thank you, that's powerful. Okay, so 6 minutes and we will restart at 11:15, okay? It's my real special privilege and honor and luck that I met Lillian a few years ago at one of the lectures, Korczak lectures. And in fact, I was using that Korczak lecture, forgive me, Jerry, to advertise my Korczak conference. And I was talking about the conference, and all of a sudden, the lady sitting in front of me, she was the first saying, "Oh, I'm interested, I will come." And you know, so many people talk like this. I thought, oh, okay. And then she came to the Korczak conference in Seattle, and then many times after and before we met. And Lillian is so inspirational and so incredibly knowledgeable about the period we're talking about and much more. Formally introducing Lillian, Lillian Boris Nemetz, a writer, a poet, a Holocaust survivor, a person who taught for many years and actually is a published writer and has books published, but at the same time she's a very strong and powerful leader among many, many people who are still here with us, fortunately, and who are champions for peace. Because when you talk about Holocaust, you actually are a champion for peace. If people remember what happened then, they would not do it again. Without any further ado, Lillian, please.
Thank you, Tatiana, for this very kind introduction. And hello, everyone. It's a tremendous honor and pleasure to see students, again, Korczak students. And I hope yes?
Can you take a microphone? Yeah.
And I hope that someday I'll be able to see a huge hall full of Korczak students, because it's a very worthwhile education. We're going to turn the clock back again today. Again, probably you've been learning theory and all kinds of wonderful things about Korczak's pedagogy. And I'm turning back the clock somewhat. I do not have a PowerPoint presentation because I simply haven't organized it as such, so as yet. So you'll have to bear with me as I look at my notes. And what I'm going to, where I've based my talk on today is this. Has anyone seen this? That's the Ghetto Diary. I delved into it in depth because in it I found the man. You know, what makes a man do what he did and be who he was. And so in some way, this was extremely helpful, and I've based some of my talk on this. This is a book which I'm sure you're familiar with by now, How to Love a Child.
Yeah, that's a new
Hello.
student. Yeah,
And this is the picture that I saw of Korczak when I visited Treblinka. It's no longer there, but it was there before, just at the entrance. And the very expression on this photo, it said everything to me. So without any further ado, these are reflections on Janusz Korczak, his heroism and its relevance to the 21st century as seen through the Warsaw Ghetto Diary. So, Janusz Korczak was and still is my hero. On one of my early trips to Poland, I made a pilgrimage to the Treblinka death camp, where he and his 200 orphans perished. And before I entered the camp, I saw a blown-up poster, which I already told you about right here, attached to a hut at the entrance. The photo of this poster can be also found in the opening pages of his ghetto diary. I stared into his eyes, mesmerized by their expression. If eyes alone can tell this grotesque story, his did. He looks out at the world with an expression of astonishment, shame, and disgust. His eyes penetrate your soul with the same. Small wonder. I entered Treblinka, the stony museum of death, reading inscriptions on the endless sea of stones, each depicting a lost Jewish community. No graves of my own family that perished there were to be found. Only one stone had the inscription of a person, Janusz Korczak and children, and the words "never again" in many languages. I ponder even now, remembering these words, promises that have not been exactly fulfilled, were they? The Treblinka experience had never left me, just as Dr. Korczak stayed in my heart and mind. I'm humbly and indirectly connected with the sad and yet heroic history of Korczak and the Warsaw Ghetto. I presume you all know what the Warsaw Ghetto was.
Oh, yeah, we spoke.
It is the children, Korczak wrote, who always have to carry the burden of history's atrocities. Indeed, and they still do. Korczak was also my father's hero, and it is from his stories that I found out what he stood for. Korczak and my father knew each other in the ghetto. My father was a policeman who picked children up off the streets, found them shelter and food. Excuse me. He helped Korczak with food for his 200 orphans. At this point, I would like to mention that what I have in common with Korczak is that we were both incarcerated in the Warsaw Ghetto at the same time. I was a child, he an elderly man. That is who I looked like then, at that time, a child. I got close to him through an incident. The streets of the ghetto reeked of garbage and bodies of men, women, and children dying from disease and starvation. People's faces looked haunted by fear and deprivation. I saw this daily when my father took me to a secret school not far from where we lived. On one such day, in the school, we were drilled in case someone knocked on the door to put away our learning materials into a box on which we sat and only leave paper and crayons on the table. It happened one day that there was a sharp knock. We children did as we were told and froze, sitting on our boxes. 2 SS officers, the most dreaded of the Nazi army, black uniforms, stomped in and started pushing our two lovely teachers around with the point of their revolvers, yelling loudly in broken Polish, then stomped out. We went home immediately. The next day, when my father brought me to the school, to my chagrin, it was boarded up with words, Schule verboten, school forbidden. That day, I and other children of the ghetto lost their rights to education, as we Jewish children lost our right to live. The janitor of the building ran out, shouting that the teachers were sent to Pawiak prison. I was in tears because I loved the little school. That was when my father took me by the hand and we walked onto Janusz Street and knocked on the door. A woman who was apparently an assistant to Korczak opened the door of a building, which my father said was the orphan's home. She knew my father and let us in. She told us that the doctor was out getting food for the children. We sat down at tables strewn with books and papers. The children sat with us for a while, then ran around and played, behaving like normal children, going about their daily lives, seemingly oblivious to the outside horror and stench. This place had an atmosphere of a world separate from the one we came from. It was Korczak's world, where a sense of peace juxtaposed the chaos outside. After a while we left, oh, thank you, and when on the street, my father, excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. On the street, my father pointed to a balcony in the same building where red geraniums grew. The only bit of color I could see in this dreary quarter. Thank you. Those were the flowers that Korczak cultivated, just as he cultivated the children of the orphanage, in a staunch pursuit of beauty against the stark ugliness in which we lived. Imagine the old doctor as he sits at night in a semi-dilapidated building on Janusz Street, hungry and tired, a glass of vodka, a piece of black bread, excuse me, a piece of black bread, blackout shades drawn, and Korczak bending over his diary in the dim light of a kerosene lamp. He will begin, he says, by digging a well. And I quote, I shall try to do something different with the story of my life. Perhaps the idea is good, perhaps it will work, perhaps this is the right way. When you dig a well, you do not start at the deepest end. First you break up the upper layer, throw the earth aside shovelful after shovelful, not knowing what is underneath. How many tangled roots? What other obstacles? How many stones forgotten and buried by yourself and others? Roll up your sleeves. A firm grip on the shovel. Let's go. This final work of mine I must do alone. End of quote. Korczak believed in honest discourse. Throughout the diary, he talks to himself and sometimes to God. And he analyzes both the questions and the answers. He wrote, you cannot even understand a child until you achieve self-knowledge. You yourself are a child whom you must learn to know, rear, and above all, enlighten. End of quote. How many of us know ourselves that way? Most of us have time to barely look deeply into our lives on the surface, but judge ourselves and others by the last event at the top, and never asking the questions, never shoveling to the bottom of the problem, thus coming up with erroneous conclusions and messages, harmful both to ourselves and to those we judge. In his diary, Korczak reveals his most profound self, which he uses as a blueprint for understanding the children. As I sit and read Korczak's ghetto diary, his words are constantly with me. For as I delve deeper and deeper into this candid and modest body of work, I understand more and more the meaning behind those words. Korczak's search for identity and his wanting to know himself and therefore deeply understand his pupils is the driving force behind all his work, and especially the diary in his own words. In the diary, Korczak writes that he learns about the children by observing them, listening to them, watching their facial expressions, the meaning behind their words and their body language, their likes, wants, and dislikes, what they say in their stories and diaries. He wants to know what each child is about in himself, not as he should be seen in the eyes of society. The orphanage becomes Korczak's laboratory, and his diary, the laboratory of his inner self, his childlike imagination, and his love for children. Korczak reaches out of time deep into his mind, his soul, into his childhood, his fantasies of another planet called Ra, and the good times of his youth, his parents, and the decrepitude of old age. Like Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, when he was incarcerated in a camp, thoughts of family, memories of good times, food, and well-being kept him going, as Korczak now sits at his desk, tired, hungry, and shabby, remembering the delicious sausage, peace, comfort, even luxury. At the same time, he's strong in his convictions that there is still beauty and goodness in the world, just like Anne Frank in her diary. But he requires something else. Boredom, he writes, is the hunger of the spirit. Nostalgia, a thirst for water and for light, for freedom, for counsel, and an understanding ear to hear my lament, unquote. The diary goes on to reveal his truth, unlike many memoirs who foiled the truth by showing off their heroism and who they know. A man of today has matured, writes Korczak, but he has not become wiser or gentler. He writes about his first realization, the dichotomy of his religious identity. He considered himself a Pole and a Jew, but was conflicted when at the age of 5 his canary died. So he put it in a box and wanted to bury it, putting a cross on top of the grave. Korczak writes, the housemaid said no, because it was only a bird, something much lower than man. Even to cry over it was a sin. Worse still, the janitor's son decided that the canary was Jewish, and so was I. I too was a Jew, and he a Pole, a Catholic. It was certain paradise for him, but not for me. I would end up when I died in a place which, though not hell, was nevertheless dark, and I was scared of a dark room, death, Jew, hell, a black Jewish paradise. Certainly plenty to think about. unquote. Korczak admits later on that his father and uncle worked hard to bridge the gap between Christians and Jews. At this point, I would like to read you part of a poem Korczak wrote in 1920, expressing his wish for the children. I translated this poem into English in September 2009, a teacher's prayer. Although gray and humble in your presence, Lord, I stand before you consumed with longing, whispering quietly. I state my wish in a voice of unflattering will. My eyes fire a plea beyond the clouds, standing tall. I ask not for myself. Please endow the children with goodwill. Offer them help in their effort. Give their toil your blessing. Lead them along a path that is not the easiest, but most excellent. The poem speaks to me. I came to Canada and my life was not an easy path, but it was an enlightening one. For through hardship, I learned independence. I remember when we child survivors came to Canada and there was no understanding ear or interest of our immediate past. And that was when I learned from someone like Korczak that it is not through avoidance of the past, but through facing it and dealing with it could I ever free myself from the shackles of a terrible memory. The diary runs like an hourglass of Korczak's life and thought, like the well that he digs till the spade reaches the bottom. Through the process of reading, I gain more and more respect for this man's thoughts and more understanding how this struggling human being exercises his will when at the end of his rope to keep the children's morale and his own alive. It takes a big, big heart with a will of gargantuan strength. The phenomenal point of the diary is that never the word Holocaust or genocide is mentioned, and rarely the ghetto. Yet you feel the oppressive sliminess of the outside world creeping slowly into the home towards a tragic denouement. Korczak describes the following. The children moon about. Only the outer appearances are normal. Underneath lurks weariness, discouragement, anger, mistrust, resentment, and longing. The seriousness of their own diaries hurts. In response to their confidences, I share mine with them as an equal. Our common experiences, theirs and mine are more diluted, watered down, otherwise the same, unquote. In the meantime, for us, deportations begin. My mother, my little sister in her arms, and I hanging onto her arm for dear life are standing in a long line up to Umschlagplatz, where the train for Treblinka death camp are waiting. We march along with the others. I cry, Mommy, don't leave me. Suddenly arms scoop us out of the line into a building where we lie on the ground in the dark corridor while the line goes on without us. We survive one more time. Not so, Korczak. And the children who walked along the same street, in the same line as we did to their death. How can I, a survivor, not feel guilty? Towards the end of his diary, Korczak sees a German soldier through the window and he writes, I am watering flowers. My bald head in the window, what a splendid target. He has a rifle. What would he do if I nodded to him? Wave my hand in a friendly gesture? This was the last diary entry in the month of August 1942. The next day, they came for the orphanage. Though Korczak was offered a reprieve, He refused, saying, "I hate desertion, and besides, my children need me." Korczak wrote the following passage elsewhere at another time. "What a tragedy is our contemporary life, and how shameful of this generation to be passing on to its children a chaotic world." This observation made by Korczak years ago is still so relevant in the 21st century. For what has changed? In closing, I would like to read you this poem called "The Last Walk." But before that, I still have a paragraph. No, I think I read the poem first. "And still they march by Jella Corvin. They march to the Umschlagplatz. The doctor leads. Behind him, the tall Abrasha with the flag. On its summer meadow green side, a spray of chestnut blossom. On the other side, bright white, a Star of David, blue. The 200 orphans, oblivious to shouts and insults, march 5 abreast, singing joyous hiking songs. Miss Stefa, the house mother, follows, the youngest in her arms. And still they march, along a path of cirrus clouds, their tatters smoothed, touched with rainbow colors, glimmers on weightless bodies, changed to shimmers of celestial light. They march, they march. And indeed, Korczak is still with us today, in a world where children are still in war zones, hungry and without shelter. But thankfully today we know that what we must do to fight for the welfare of children and their rights, the Korczak way. Thank you.
Lillian, thank you so much.
I just have a little addition.
Please.
I would just like to add that this diary was somehow miraculously saved by Igor Neverly, who writes that the day after Korczak and the children were deported, a red-haired boy brought him the package with the diary in it, which Korczak had apparently promised Neverly to send to him. Neverly took the package to the Polish orphanage, where the caretaker promised to brick it up under the eaves. After the war, it was given to the Polish Writers' Union, where it remained unpublished during the Stalinist years. After the thaw of 1956, Neverly included the diary in a publication of a 4-volume anthology of Korczak's work. That's what I wanted to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lillian. Questions, comments, please.
First, I have to get a Kleenex. Excuse me. It's cold. Any questions? No questions? Not interested?
No, it's overwhelming. It's not because they're not
Of course.
interested. Yes, yeah.
It's always like that. It's hard to know where to pick up a thread from something like this.
Comments? Anything which relates to what Lillian was talking about, what you learned during this institute, and some connecting dots, Jane?
So you said towards the end about how relevant it is to today. The children have to carry the burden of history's atrocity. I'm just wondering just how you personally deal with that, and what more thoughts you have about that.
It's an interesting question. I have faced my past and probably fought with it for quite a while until I learned what to do with it. And my way of dealing with it was I go to schools as an outreach from the Holocaust Center, and I speak against racism. And I write about it. I write and write poetry and so on. And I'm trying to make something out of something as senseless as as the Holocaust was. And when I see children from various countries, in camps, and even those who come here, one of the reporters wrote, we have immigrants and the children, they are very resilient and they are very happily playing outside. But get into the head of those children, what they have been through. Does anybody bother? Only Korczak would. Who bothers to understand the children who came out of these war zones and what they suffered? And everybody describes everything on the outside. Children are happily playing, and so everything's fine. No?
Yeah, true.
You know?
I wrote the name of Igor Nedelny, his secretary, and the one who published a lot. If you want to read more, it's on the board.
Does that answer your question? How do you deal with your past?
Each one has skeletons in the cupboard.
Skeletons in the cupboard.
Yeah, it's difficult to deal with them. Yeah, truly. Claire, do you want to say something?
No, just thinking about dealing with the past, and it's just work every single day
Yes, and
to do better and learn and grow
and you know that you can't run away from it. Even though I remember when I came here and everybody said, oh, let it go, forget about it. How on earth do you do that?
Yeah.
You don't have to grovel over it. You don't have to examine, your navel every day, but I think you need to find a place for it and deal with it there. Hmm? Yeah?
When you came to Canada, were you a child still?
I was 12.
12? So how did they deal with that? Because nowadays we talk about PTSD and the psychologists helping out kids. In those days, how were you welcomed?
Well, that's an excellent observation. And one of my pet injustices that I talk about, I came to Montreal, and I wanted to talk to someone about what I had experienced. Of course, I didn't know English very well yet, but I knew a little bit. So I told my school friend there, I said, I want to tell you something about Warsaw and Poland. And she looked at me with a strange look and said, let's go and play. What I'm trying to say is nobody listened. We talked about Korczak. Who listened? Nobody listens. I mean, even now, people have no time. They are busy. Who listens to someone? But a child certainly needs that. So I had a very hard time, and as a result, I created another personality. The personality was the one I figured Canadians would like. I pretended to be happy-go-lucky, and I had jokes, and I just did my thing, but inside, I had to cope at night with my nightmares and so on. Yes?
At what point were you forced to face that, really face that past and accept that past? What happened?
Well, that's also a good question, because as time went on and my parents told me that I should act as though I were born in Canada, because they didn't listen either. They were busy making a living. They didn't have time to listen to me, and they never discussed it at home. Nothing, nobody. It was like, shh, don't talk about it, forget it. So I went on to my studies, with which I struggled but eventually got through. Then I went on to get married, and I had 2 wonderful children. still have. And then one day it hit me like a ton of bricks, because things trigger memories, things that happen. And then I knew that I either coped with it or forget it. You know, I would end up in, I don't know where. And so I made a drastic move in my life. And sometimes you have to destroy in order to create, to build. And that's what I did. And I found myself slowly, little by little. Yeah.
I just want to say I really, really admire what you did and what you do now. So I'm just wondering, like, I know you're like as a writer, how does writing help you to cope with all the like trauma?
You know, there's a book called, I mean, I write because I feel compelled to write. Not necessarily only because I want to tell my stories, but because I have it in me to create these images and metaphors and things that I do in poetry also. But there is a book called Writing as Healing. I can't remember the author, but I think if you Google Writing as Healing, you'll get the author. And also, I tell you, when you have something on your mind, and you take it from here and put it on the page, immediately you discharge some of the angst, and you share it with your page, and later on hope to share it with other people. Korczak was a great advisor to write notes, to make notes and to write diaries. And from those notes, he learned how his students felt. You see, and the diaries and he knew exactly their mood and how they functioned. And similarly in writing, when I taught writing, it was get a book, and every morning when you get up, jot down your dreams, jot down your thoughts. It doesn't matter what they are. And this is an incredible activity. So I would say whether you paint or play music or create music, compose or play, whatever art you may be proficient in, that would do the same thing. Because that is a form of self-expression. Not self-expression as somebody wants you to express, but as you need to express. Yeah?
You mentioned that your parents asked you not to talk about what you went through. What about your children? Did you talk to them? Did they ask questions?
Well, that is just it. My latest book talks about the transference of trauma to it's intergenerational. You transfer your trauma to your children, and they may transfer it's written in the DNA. So, it's bound to happen. When my son was 12, and he's a most incredible human being, who even at 12 already showed his huge soul and his goodness. And he listened. He listened. Like Korczak. And I was able to tell him a few things. I didn't tell him any terrible things because he was probably too young. But I started with smaller things. Things that happened about the war and this and that. And he sat and listened, and it made my life so much better. Whereas my daughter, who was 3 years younger, I could not talk to her. Somehow, I don't think she wanted, because there are people who don't want to hear these things, unfortunately, still today. So, you have to go with the flow. I was able to talk to him, but not to her. And today, later on when the Holocaust Society had educational center, had conferences, my son would come with me to introduce me and to talk about how he felt with his mother being the survivor. So he was the one later on. So somehow it created a positive attitude on his part and a good relationship between us. Yeah.
Simone Veil, who was a politician and a writer also from France, and she was
Who, I'm sorry, I didn't
Simone Veil.
Oh yes, Simone Veil, yeah.
And she was saying that when she came back from the camps, people looked at her with pity and they would buy her clothes, and she said, that's not what I need. I wanted somebody to help me with whatever happened to me.
Yeah, psychologically.
So when you talk to students, or if you meet people that come from war zones, are you capable of telling them what, or to help them ease into the society?
Yes, very much so. I talk to students from various cultures and immigrants, and then they ask the questions, and they really, I think the young students are so wonderful and so full of empathy. It isn't pity that a survivor wants. It's empathy. There is this concept of an enlightened witness, which was described by Alice Miller, who studied under Jung and wrote books like You Shall Not Be Aware, Breaking the Wall of Silence, The Drama of the Gifted Child. Wonderful. I found myself in those books. And, you know, you just do what you feel that you need to do to tell your story, but not to seek any kind of pity. Nobody wants that. Just understanding. And this is what, I don't know if the world has gone to the point where very few people seem to be sensitive to things that are happening or have compassion. This is why Korczak looms so big. I mean, look at him. If that isn't just a complete, you know, this is compassion, this is understanding, not pity. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Who was that person that said an enlightened witness?
Enlightened witness? Oh, I'm sorry. I tried to answer the question and bring something else up. So Alice Miller feels that if you have a problem and you have no one to listen, no one who will listen, but then you find someone who will listen with compassion and understanding, not pity, but who will truly absorb your angst and understand what it's about and where it comes from. And then you tell your story to this person becomes a witness to your story and becomes an enlightened witness because they are capable of understanding it. Like Korczak was. Korczak was an enlightened witness to hundreds of children's stories. And I wish there were more Korczaks in the world. I mean, it's not just about having a psychiatrist. Psychiatry completely failed understanding children of war in North America. This is a proven fact because it wasn't the experience in North America and they couldn't understand. So someone like me, I would go and tell him about the Warsaw Ghetto because it disturbed me where I came from. And he was doing yoga. I mean, he had no understanding. And then he kept on asking about what's your relationship with your mother? Do you have good sexual relationships with your husband? I mean, it has nothing to do with what I needed him to, he couldn't be the enlightened witness. Do you know what I mean?
We were talking about, Lillian, about the culture in North America, which is, how are you doing? I'm great. No one wants to hear how you are really doing.
No, because
And that's the problem.
Jerry came up with something a while ago, where he said that somebody asked him how he was doing, he said very badly, and they said that's good.
I have even a more grave story. A colleague of mine at UW, a professor, he was passing by his manager and she said, how are you doing? And he said, oh, I'm okay, but my wife was diagnosed with cancer. Oh, that's great.
Right.
And she passed by, and next day, she wrote a message to him saying, you know, it's just dawned on me. You said cancer? Did I hear you right? And I said, great, how horrible of me. At least she remembered. Yeah, but that's the culture. We're all on the surface. No one wants to go deeper and hear.
Is it fear?
I think, no, it's not fear. It's lack of empathy. It's lack of sensitivity. It's individualistic culture, which doesn't want to accept and embrace someone else. If I'm happy, I'm comfortable in my little bubble or a little bigger bubble, I think I'm okay. I don't want to take your pain because it's too much for me. I think this inability to embrace a bigger world, but when people have it, I think it's a huge talent.
Well,
but I think, but I think for educators and anyone who is working in the field of helping professions, it's an absolute must to have.
Yes.
Otherwise, you can't work in this field if you can't embrace somebody's
Absolutely.
pain. Yeah.
So we need more. We need enlightened witnesses. Because like Korczak, he was an enlightened witness. So we cannot just look out there. We have to look into ourselves, as he did in this diary. There are many more things I couldn't quote, but he uses himself as a blueprint for understanding, for looking at life through the eyes of someone who wants to make life better for children and for others too. And he also was a child, he had a childlike thing in himself, He was able to write these children's stories, to put down his fantasies, and that's why he was able to help children to understand the world around them and let them create their own ideas, their own who they are, to be who they are, not who they are expected to be.
Yeah, I think we're extremely